What's up? It's Gamer Froggy. Welcome back to my channel for another installment of the Sims 4 American Girl doll build series. Today, we are making the sim of the controversial Felicity Merriman. Let's jump into her description from the American Girl doll wiki before the drama begins. Felicity Merriman is the fourth historical character representing English colonial America and the early American Revolutionary War period. Felicity is a 10-year-old girl living in Williamsburg, Virginia, when it and many places were still part of the English colonies in North America. She is the oldest of three, later four, children. She and her family, as well as Ben and their two enslaved people, Rose and Marcus, live on Duke of Gloucester Street, the main thoroughfare, and the house is located between Queen Street and the fictionally named Center Lane. She was born earlier than expected, and her mother, Martha, says she has been impatient and in a hurry ever since. She is of English background on both sides. Her father, Edward, is descended from an English lord, Sir Edward Merriman, and her mother's parents immigrated to the colonies from England. Felicity is a daring and fiercely independent-minded girl. She is tomboyish, daring, adventurous, spunky, and both brave and foolhardy. She feels that if she can do something, she will, despite the risks. She is very active for a girl her age, but is annoyed at her lack of freedom as a young girl and the ladylike things and personality that is expected of her. Felicity believes in fighting for what she wants and can be stubborn and headstrong. This helps give her a strong connection to Benjamin Davidson once they start to become friends. When she wants something, she goes for it, quite often without thinking about the consequences, and sets her heart on things often. Her mother, Martha, often lectures her to think before she acts and set a good example as the oldest of the family. When Felicity is angry, she's never afraid to speak her mind and stand up to bullies, as she did with Jiggy Nye and the boy that taunted her and the horses, Robert. Felicity loves horses more than anything, as shown through her affection for Penny and her dedicated care and concern towards her from the start, even when Penny is not hers. Felicity learned to ride and make friends with horses at her grandfather's plantation. This aids her in taming Penny, but is a hindrance when it gives her overconfidence and Felicity takes a dare. Felicity is good with coming up with names, having come up with Polly's, Posies, Pennies, Patriots, and the taunting nickname for Annabelle Cole of Banana Bell. For the most part, Felicity is tomboyish and is constantly fussed at for not being very ladylike. She is quite impatient and rushes through activities she finds dull and boring, and is often flighty and thoughtless. She is frequently chided for not finishing her tasks, avoiding others, or tending to her domestic work improperly. She shows disinterest in chores and studies such as cooking, sewing, dance, and other expected feminine skills. Sewing especially bores her, and she is frequently sloppy and careless in her work. As she matures, she finds interest in activities such as playing her guitar, events such as dancing at a fancy dancing lesson and ball, and learning how to serve tea, all while still remaining quite active. She starts showing her maturity later and becomes more ladylike. Felicity enjoys working in her father's store, Merriman store, where she likes to imagine where all the items come from before arriving there. She has not done much of it since Ben's arrival, disappointing her. She tends to act more like a fine lady at the store when helping. She learns to whistle from Ben. Felicity loves nature and the great outdoors and enjoys gardening, especially in her part of the family garden. She also enjoys making her best friend Elizabeth laugh. American Girl characterizes her as spunky and sprightly. American Girl Publishing describes her as independent, loyal, and spirited. So Felicity is a horse girl from colonial America. I want to start by saying that Felicity herself is not a problematic character necessarily. She is a little girl growing up in a time period where owning slaves is acceptable. These critiques are not on the character herself or the people who enjoyed her as a doll. I never owned Felicity, but I always wanted her when I was a kid. I thought she was so pretty, and I even named my car after her because the color reminds me of her eyes. I just thought she was the prettiest doll, and I loved her for it, so there's absolutely no shade on anyone who owned or loved the doll and her character. So if I'm not going to criticize the doll, then what is the controversy actually about? Well, the controversy is how American Girl handled this story. Let's start with two very important facts. First, the colonial time period is a very important and defining part of American history because it's where we gained our independence from British rule and dealt with the aftermath of the separation. Second, slavery was a legal and common practice during and after this time. It's important to not erase the history of slavery because it's a disservice to those that were harmed. We can remember history without condoning it. Slavery should be depicted in historical settings, but only in a negative and sympathetic light to the slaves. Slavery is not a backdrop for a little girl to have her horse girl struggles. It was a very long and horrible life for hundreds of Black Americans. If American Girl didn't want to address the slavery, then it shouldn't have been in Felicity's story in the first place. See, the problem with including slavery in a historical story is when the creators ignore it and use it as a piece of setting. Like I said in Molly's video about war, human struggle is not a backdrop. I want American Girl to cover these difficult and traumatic pieces of history. These stories of little girls living in these terrible times are inspiring to modern-day kids because they persevere no matter how bad life gets. But slavery is not a backdrop, nor should it ever have been treated as such. If the Felicity books had her and her family care for the enslaved people as much as Felicity cared about her abused horse Penny, there wouldn't be as much of a problem. But she doesn't seem to care about the slaves because it's rarely brought up in the stories except in passing. So if these enslaved people are barely worth more than a few mentions in the books, why were they included at all? It's important to remember and talk about slavery because it's part of our history. We can have intelligent and civil conversations about the horrors of slavery while not condoning it. So let's talk about the history of slavery in the colonial time period. First, it's notable that Africans were not the only race subject to slavery when America was first colonized. The Native Americans living there were enslaved first. The reason African slavery took off was because of the triangle trade. The following quote is from battlefields.org, which is linked down below. Quote, "The triangle trade largely defines the economics of slavery in the colonial era. In this cyclical system, slave traders imported enslaved Africans to North American colonies. Colonists, in turn, exported goods like lumber, tobacco, and sugar to Great Britain, where those materials were transformed into the finished luxury goods like rum and textiles that merchants sold or traded along the African coast for enslaved Africans to be sent to the North American colonies. Slave traders violently captured Africans and loaded them onto slave ships, where for months these individuals endured the Middle Passage, the crossing of the Atlantic from Africa to the North American colonies or West Indies. Many Africans did not survive the journey." End quote. This in itself is a really interesting and horrible piece of history. Felicity could have met a slave that came across the Middle Passage and have tried to convince her parents to help free the slave or to understand the horrors of slavery. This, of course, would play into the white savior complex, where the white person saves the minority in the story, but in my opinion, it would be better than just ignoring the slaves entirely. It would be better if the enslaved person helped to free themselves, rather than Felicity being the only one helping them. And if they were to work together, that could create a better story. It's just a thought, American Girl, that you can take for free. Now, some may argue that freeing slaves would be unrealistic given the time period. As a counter, continuing on from the same article, quote, "It is in this context of the evolution of slavery in colonial America that in 1688, Quakers in Germantown, Pennsylvania, presented the first petition against the institution of slavery. The petition argued that slavery violated basic human rights based upon the biblical golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you. The petition was neither adopted nor rejected and largely forgotten until the 19th century." End quote. A good parallel going with this hypothetical other story that Felicity could have had is an allegory between the slavery against the Africans and Native Americans that the colonists were doing and the quote-unquote slavery that some Americans saw they were under the British rule. There could have been an allegory between the way that the British were ruling the colonists and the way that these colonists are ruling the slaves. That could have been a very interesting story. So, going back to the quote, not everyone in colonial America thought that slavery was moral or humane. Some did try to fight it, and that could have been part of Felicity's story. Or, again, American Girl could have forgotten the addition of slaves in Felicity's family altogether and not used their addition as a plot device. I personally don't connect with her story very much, which is why her build is less extravagant than the previous girls we've covered. I wish that American Girl had done more with her story because the revolutionary time period is actually fascinating. I mean, Lin-Manuel Miranda was able to make a 2-hour-long musical Hamilton based on this time period, and he was focusing on just one person in this historical time. It makes sense for American Girl to cover this time period because it is the defining time period in American history. This is when we became independent. We have our 4th of July Independence Day celebration because of this time period. We could have a much more interesting story than a girl and her horse with slavery in the background. Overall, I'm not a fan of this story, but like I said, this isn't a criticism of the doll itself or people who like her. She is just a doll, she's just a vessel for a story. This is a criticism on the company that produced her. Now, American Girl doesn't sell a Felicity along with a handful of other dolls, which is unfortunate. I would like to see them revamp her story to be more patriotic and steadfast in the face of British control and re-release her. Anyways, my monologue is done. Thank you for listening. so much for watching this video. I know today's topic was heavier than the past ones, but it's very important to talk about. Not talking about the horrific parts of history doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It just means that it's forgotten and at a higher risk of being repeated. American Girl could have done a lot more research and crafted a much better narrative for their historical dolls. Thank you again for watching, and if you are interested in the article I was reading from, the link is in the description, and I'll see you in the next one.